Hey everyone, welcome to Type Talks. Today we have Tim and we have Michael again. And Tim is an INTP and Michael is an INTJ. And they're going to go over the differences between the INTJ and the INTP. Now, these types, they seem similar from the 4-letter code, but they're actually completely opposite because they don't use any of the same cognitive functions. So today we will go over these differences and Tim will take the stage. So Tim, what are some differences you see between you and INTJs?
Good question. So I think INTPs and INTJs as a contrast, it's pretty interesting because from the outside, right? Like if you're not an INTP and you're not an INTJ, we probably look kind of similar. But I think that the experience of being an INTP or being an INTJ it's about as opposite as it could be. Well, maybe not. I mean, we're both still kind of introverts. We both still kind of have some similarities, but in terms of cognitive functions and sort of the way that we relate to the world, we're going to have quite a lot of differences. INTPs lead with TI as their primary function, and that's a judging function. There's internally we have this sort of internal representation of the world that we're always working on, and we're always focused on getting right. And an NI driver is a different thing. I wonder if Michael, maybe you could tell us what it's like to have NI as your driver.
I mean, that's open. Well, I mean, it's how to describe NI? It's just open. I mean, I think the interesting thing about INTJs and INTPs is that it's not just our function stacks that are completely different. It's also that our judging and perceiving axes are swapped too. So, I mean, leading with a perceiving function, I think that we can, speaking of INTJs, I mean, we can be seen as very rigid and demanding in the same way that there's sometimes where when an INTP is right, you know what I mean? They're right. But that's coming from TE, when the fact is that I'm happy to change any opinion, belief at any point if, I mean, not even depending on if it's the correct information, but just like if it's just, the right pinball comes into the machine at the right time and it's like, oh, let's follow that. So it sort of drifts, I think, if that makes sense.
So Tim, my question for you is like, how do you relate to the rightness fixation of INTPs? Do you not relate? Do you relate? What parts are true and what parts aren't?
I relate. I would say that I think that the rightness fixation it's something that every INTP, I think, has to deal with, or at least at a certain point in their growth, because I think what can happen is we have this TI driver and it's right a lot, but not always. But we tend to, over time, put a lot of faith in it. And so what can happen is that we're wrong, and you totally cannot convince us that we're wrong. And it takes a little bit of living and realizing that you're wrong a few times before you can kind of soften that a little bit, maybe. But I would say that there's that aspect of it, and there's also the desire to be right. It's like there's this idea of what do I want to do with myself, like what this desire to kind of have it all figured out before you actually go and do anything in the world. And so that could also be sort of a rightness pattern of like going and searching and trying to find truth and not actually ever doing anything with what you have, like never being satisfied with that. So I don't know, like I guess two different ways of looking at rightness for INTPs.
That's interesting. I'm wondering if it's because like TI kind of needs to vet logic before it lets it in. So sometimes it can be kind of stubborn with what it lets in if it seems like wrong logically. But maybe that's a thinker thing too. So Michael, do you relate, not relate, or?
I do. I mean, I think that I can see the issue is I get very fixated on being correct about something, but what that thing is could change from day to day. I mean, that's the thing about backseat FI is that it can sort of, depending on what side of the bed you wake up on sometimes, if you're not sort of on top of like an idea of right and wrong or whatever the, I mean, especially when it comes to like ethics and morality, you know, that is something that needs to be kept almost consciously at the front of mind, because otherwise it's just however I'm feeling, I'm gonna project that out. And if there's an issue that's contentious, then it's being right is more about like winning an argument at that point when you're in an unhealthy state, but it has nothing to do with like this is right and it's consistent with my with some internal logic. It's much more FI based, I think.
It's true. Antonia Dodge says that INTJs vet people for usefulness and INTPs vet people for data. So maybe that might be a difference, because like it's more like the INTP will vet for TI and the INTJ will vet for TE. Like I just want to see if it rings true with you guys.
I think so. I mean, the question is, what does usefulness mean? Because it could be used in so many contexts. I mean, it's a lot of times. I mean, what I appreciate about INTPs and about TI in general is just like the desire for information for its own sake, right? And then for me, I'm taking in information all the time, but two things I need to do is one is externalize it, because I don't have a mechanism that's just that retains information and that is just random access in the way that I think TI is a lot of the time. And there's also a sense of, I don't know what's going to be useful in the future. So it can look like taking in and absorbing a lot of information, but it's really, I mean, it's sort of setting it aside for the future so that when I need this, whatever structure of knowledge it is, or whatever structure of information, whatever data, I know where it is. I've gone through it. I've externalized it, but it's like it's almost external to me until it's useful.
Yeah, I think my INI draws off. It's like TI is the script or the map or whatever, and INI just grabs some of that stuff and improvs based on it. I don't know.
Well, can I say that that's a huge difference, because I'm sitting here, I'm the one sitting here taking notes, so I don't forget the thing that I 10 seconds after I think it. At the beginning of this clip, after Tim, he sort of kicked us off, you went to me, and I panicked for like 5 seconds because I was like, I have absolutely nothing. I don't know. If anybody wants to go back to the beginning of the video, it's the absolute INTJ like terror for like 5 seconds. I actually looked really frivolous, but I was like, oh man, I don't know where I'm going with this. Whereas INTPs, and I mean ENTPs, and maybe perceivers more in general, we'll just go. Look, I'm not going to show you, but like I got notes. I don't want to show you so you can freeze frame and see my notes. It feels very personal, but I'm just telling you, I'm just admitting it. Like I've got notes here.
Yeah, when I have perceivers on the show, I'm like, do you guys have anything prepared? And they're like, Joyce, I'm just gonna go with the flow. Like, ask me anything.
It's just way easier to not prepare.
Have you ever just absolutely frozen though, Tim? Have you ever absolutely frozen? You say, I've gone over this information 1,000 times and I don't know what I'm looking for right now. You know what I mean?
Like I might not know something, but I can usually like reroute and get around my not knowing it.
Yeah.
I don't know. Or I can just say, I don't know. Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, but you say, I don't know, but we're sitting here, we're having a YouTube video, and then like Joyce keeps coming back to me and I keep saying, I don't know. That's the fear. That's horrifying to me. Every time it's like, I really got nothing, Joyce. You know what I mean?
It's interesting because like the IJs, like I need to prepare because I need to be able to like already anticipate the obstacles so I can like whatever comes at me, I've already prepared and so I can deal with it. But like the impromptu, it kind of is scary because you're kind of on the spot. And it's like you're just frozen. It feels like like when a judger doesn't get enough time to prepare, it can sometimes feel like they're afraid that it's wasting like time or something, like, or it's like they're on the spotlight but it's not doing anything. I don't know how to explain it. Sorry.
Do you think that plays into the invulnerability fixation for IJs a little bit? Like that worry of, oh, I'm not going to have this ready. And then so you have to do all this up front.
Yeah, it could also be like, feeling like a duty to like maybe say something that it has something of value, and then like you're not saying anything because you're bad at improvising, so then you just feel bad. But yeah, it might have to do with invulnerability. Your thoughts, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, there is a specific skill that is making prepared remarks seem improvisatory, and that's something. Yeah, so if I'm doing, I have to do a lot of like webinars for work, etc., and I write down to the letter, including
Wow.
pause here, every single thing. But I don't think see, I wish I had an example here where I could just write, where I could say like that whole thing I just said, that was all verbatim. You know what I mean? Like what I've written out. I prepare because otherwise there's just this, even if you perform well in the moment, there's always this like ambient sense of panic that's there, that like if there's a possibility that I haven't covered my bases, and I lose the thread that I know I know what it is, but I lose it in the moment, then everything will be a calamity. So it's preparing in order to avoid like that sense of just like low frequency panic all the time, at least for me.
Yeah, I wonder if it's inferior SE, because it's kind of like the SE is improvising in the moment and just reacting as it comes. For me, I'm not going off of something that's in the moment, so it has to be prepared beforehand, because otherwise I'm so out of tune with the present as it's happening that it needs to be beforehand, so then I can capture some sort of idea that I've thought about and post-processed. And that brings me to the point that maybe like introverted intuition is more about post-processing. So when NI doesn't have that processing time to like prepare and organize their ideas, they won't be able to like react on the spot all the time, and they can feel kind of nervous, or like the sense of calamity that Michael talked about, because they need that time to post-process before speaking.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. So like, because especially with NI, like you count on your NI to be able to make connections between things, right? But it doesn't do that on demand. It's like you get it whenever it hits you, right? It's sort of like an insight that just happens. I can see how that would be disturbing. I can imagine what that's like, I think.
That's what I was trying to say at the beginning. I said, when I was saying that it sort of drifts, and it's sort of like if I'm working through a problem, the best thing I can do is take a nap. Like just laying there, and there's that space, there's that gap between consciousness and unconsciousness, and you just can sort of get the wheel turning on an idea, and like that's the space where it's just everything, not all at once all the time, but everything just sort of clarifies itself. Whereas I think a lot of times with NE, it's bouncing ideas off of people. I mean, I've seen you improvise, Tim. I know how it works, and I know what it looks like in action, and that's just you. Yeah, I think the analog to like INTPs, like being socially like improvisatory, is like an INTJ taking a nap. I think those two things are getting at, they're driving toward the same end goal. Yeah.
Yeah, and when I talk to INTPs like Tim, like we'll start with a thought, and then they'll like sidetrack, and then we'll sidetrack again. So it'll be this cool new thought, but it's unrelated to that main thought we were talking about, but it's also very cool. It's just like not the most pertinent to what we were initially talking about.
Yeah, see, so what that is, it's that you asked me something that I didn't actually have the immediate answer to. So like if it was something in my TI, then I would probably just be able to give you an answer. But if it's not, then I kind of just like improvise and go off over here, wherever my NE kind of takes me, if that makes sense. I think that's what's happening.
Yeah, whatever it is, it's very cool. So I guess we can talk a little bit about TE and TI. So I guess maybe Michael can explain TE, and Tim, you can say whether you resonate or not resonate with certain parts.
Okay.
I think TE is just everything is driven towards some goal. So it's like everything is sort of laid. Everything sort of lays itself out in a linear fashion, and there's some end that you're trying to meet. It's nothing for its own sake, ultimately. Whereas Tim, if you want to describe TI.
Yeah, so TI is kind of like TI recognizes that there's like contingencies in things, like thing A has to happen before thing B can happen, and it kind of is a map or a network. I used web last time, and apparently that's NE, not my TI, but it's like a structure, I suppose, that links concepts together along logical connections. Like I think of it sometimes in my mind, it's like a chandelier, like of contingencies. Like this concept is contingent on that concept. And so when you have a new piece of information that comes in, TI wants to take that and see where it fits in what it already has. Because it's constantly making this map. And that map, once it's in the map, it's really fast to find things in there. So it's really easy if you have a good set of beliefs as a TI driver, when you hear something new, to know whether like that makes sense or not. Is that possible? Is that something that could be true based on all of this stuff that I've carefully groomed and made sure it all fit together in TI. So yeah, I would say that's what it's like. And that gets back to what we were talking about earlier with the rightness fixation of what can happen if that network is wrong. When certain things, like it could be a small thing that's true, but you don't see it as true because it doesn't fit your model at all. And there's seriously no way to fit that thing in without reworking a whole bunch of other parts. So it's like INTPs can get really stuck in one belief system. It's very easy to do that. And I'm rambling at this point, so.
Michael?
I think I think what Tim's describing is it sounds like closure is the objective of the process, right? Because this is like almost an infinitely expanding, like, I mean, now I don't want to say web, but I'll say it like web of knowledge and or logic. Whereas it feels like with T, it feels like it's always rebuilding from the ground up is what it feels like to me, which is everything is, if there's knowledge that's specific to a project, or there's data that's specific to one project, once that's over, I want to cast off that knowledge. I mean, I want to know where it is if I need it later, but it's not there in the random access memory. It's sort of like it's just parked because I like it's that closed loop. If there are open loops, like if there are things that haven't been sorted out that need to be, something's being held up, delayed, something, there are human obstacles in the way of the goals, then that's, I think, extremely frustrating to just like pure TE.
That is so cool. It seems like you guys view contingencies differently. So like Tim views contingencies as being a logical like web of any understandings and TI understandings, where it's kind of like figuring out how one logical piece puzzle pieces with another logical piece and how these fit together. And it's like this web of TI and NE where he's trying to perfect the logical where these fit in his mind so they make sense and they're logically congruent and consistent. But it seems like, Michael, your understanding of contingency is outer world contingency. So it's more like what is the logical contingency of the end goal at this moment like require, and then it's about like fixing the logic or like to fit the contingency of the outer world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe specifically NITE, because I mean what I'm describing when describing TE is just pure TE, but I'm leading with NI, which is much more open. And once you putting those two together, it's playing out every way that this situation can turn out, you know. And there's a lot of just chaotic, like, I don't know, happenstance that's involved in that. So it's a very strange process, because it's hard to explain logically, like why this is going to be this is going to put you in a really bad situation in 5 years, saying that to somebody, but you can't explain why. You know what I mean? But it's still that it's like timelines are just it's projecting many timelines, and just that sense of I know how this is gonna turn out. I don't know.
Wow. Okay. So it seems like, Michael, you're talking about NI contingencies too. So NI kind of like it replays future scenarios, or it goes over like what it thinks that possible future scenarios can be, and it creates contingency plans. So it's like it could happen this way, and there's a likelihood it would happen this way, and I'm like mentally preparing for the contingencies that could arise. And like the TE is also working with that. So it's like this very well fleshed out understanding of how to plot for the future that an INTJ has.
Yeah,
So
I think, yeah, that's the wrap we got, I think.
So Tim, would you like to describe your experience with SI?
Yeah, SI and NE are inseparable, of course. So SI is I'm continually like upgrading my understanding of SI. So what I've been thinking about a lot lately is how SI contrasts with NI, and how we think of NI as being the perspectives function, but SI kind of is a perspectives function too, just in a different way, where NI has insights about perspectives, but SI collects them. So as you're going about your day as an SI user, you meet people, you talk to people, you get new information and experiences of what it's like to be you in that day, or the story that you hear from someone else. Those experiences are kind of recorded and cataloged. And each experience kind of has like things that might come later. All right, so you have these SI experiences that you've saved, and then later on in the future, you're in a situation and you need to have information to make decisions. NE finds the SI experience that most closely matches what you're currently dealing with, and is able to improvise off of it to make those connections. So it's like for someone who has the SI-NE polarity versus someone who has the NI-SE polarity, the insight for a SI-NE person is external. Like the insights come in the moment as we're doing the thing. And for NI-SE, the insights are coming internally during the review process. That would be like the SI for me. Yeah, does that answer your question?
That's really profound. Michael, do you have anything to add?
I'm wondering, Joyce, how would you summarize everything that Tim just said? I had, my mind was going in 5 different directions based on what you were saying, but I was trying to make all these connections between, you know, the different polarities. How did you read that though?
Yeah, so I do think that there are similarities between SI and NI, and I think the difference is that when NI stores something, it's irrelevant until it fits into a pattern. So it's like, okay, I collect things, but I don't really care or like value it until it connects to my ability to fit it into a pattern or overarching, poignant theme. Because that's where it's important to me. And that's why with any SI users, you'll see how they can random access experiences or like certain SI symbols in their database that they've, sorry, database might be a bad way to put it, in their archive of SI. They can random access experiences, symbols, and they don't always have to fit into this cohesive, thought out all the way through pattern, but you can recall it just instantly, and it's like it's like a talent. Whereas like for NI, I kind of have to post process how it's significant in a pattern to be able to want to say it, or else I don't want to just say a symbol. It has to connect back to a pattern. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that does. That totally makes sense. And that idea of information being irrelevant. The hard thing to describe is how you can, I think maybe especially as an NI driver, is you can see that point of connection. You can see in post-processing when something connects. I'm thinking of a specific example. Last summer, they pulled a there was a ship that was traveling around, and it was a replica of the Santa Maria, and it was built to scale, and they were pulling it in a different port, so they brought it into the port of Rochester, where I am. And so I went to see this thing, and the experience of seeing it it's almost like I didn't experience the experience itself, because the whole experience crystallized around like the connections between my sense perception of this ship and everything that was sort of tangentially related to that in my mind. So I'm on the ship, and I'm not like experiencing the ship in the moment. I'm thinking like the Pequod in Moby Dick is like no more than twice the size of this thing, and this thing is really small. And that's, for me, is not information that's relevant just to that subject, but it's almost like it identifies a gap between like my subjective experience of space and this objective experience. So it's very hard to describe these things, because like you want to give sensory detail in a description of a process, but like the whole point is that it's sort of sensory detail is like subsumed in this NI process of just like everything being pulled apart and going in all different directions, trying to find the connection in the mind.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, Michael. It's almost like SI and NI, they crystallize things, but they crystallize different things. So NI kind of crystallizes the impression of the event and how it relates to like a bigger picture. So it's kind of like removing the little details attached to that event, but it's crystallizing that pattern within that event. So it's meta crystallizing, if that makes sense. Whereas like SI might be crystallizing the concrete thing that happened, whereas the NE, the extroverted intuition, is what is the meta part of that, if that makes sense. Tim, do you have anything to add?
Sure. Yeah, I think that, well, first of all, I can kind of identify with what Michael was saying about like his experience of being on that ship. I would do, like, I don't have NI, but I would similarly oftentimes be in my head. Like for me, SE is like pretty far down there. So I could get into my SE on the ship and, okay, this is the wood and this is what it feels like. And this is kind of how the light falls in and it looks like this. And I could have an SE experience, but most likely when I'm on the ship, I'm going to be in my head, and I'm going to be bouncing around to all different ideas, little things that are interesting. I guess it wouldn't be an I, but maybe that's the experience of intuitives in general, is we are often in our head.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think Carl Jung, I could be misquoting him. I think he called intuitives absent-minded. So they're kind of like at an event, but they're in their own head while they're there. For me, it kind of feels like I'm stuck in my head. Like I can be experiencing the event, but a part of me is always still in my head.
Yeah.
But the question is, when you're in your head, I guess, Tim, where do you see your mind going? Like, what's the object of the thinking? Because I think, especially as introverts, we're going to be in our heads quite a bit. But I mean, is that TI then? Like, if you were to put yourself on the Santa Maria, right? Like,
Yeah.
like what ideas do you think that might conjure up?
I don't know. So my mind tends to be very random. It will, like, I might be more present with where I am, thinking about the things that are around me. I might not. I might have something completely different on my mind about a conversation that I had. And especially like if I'm waiting around for something, or maybe I get down in the ship and I see an interesting object and I start thinking about it, like, that's really weird. Like, I see how the rope comes down and ties around this thing, but like, how would they move that? And now I'm thinking about, like, how does it work? And I'm trying to make inferences and stuff like that. So I guess my mind, it's constantly shifting and moving around and doing a bunch of stuff. Hard to pin it down to one thing, I guess.
TINE, it sounds like.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. How's your experience with the ship, Michael?
Yeah, it feels like a more like just abstract experience of like space and time. So it has nothing to do with fixed ideas or anything. It's funny because I don't even remember. I don't remember like being there, but I remember the sort of connection points of it from the experience. You know what I mean? I don't know. I just pulled that out just as one experience of this, but it's so hard to describe these introverted perceiving functions. Sometimes you try to find an analogy that fits, right?
Yeah, it's almost like you're waiting for that aha that connects all of these meaningless, trivial experiences until they accumulate to some sort of common thread. So you're like waiting until the common thread gets triggered. So what is actually like feels like home to the NI user is when they're able to trace the things that certain things share, so you can get at a larger pattern. So it's looking for actually similarities within concepts so you can grasp a pattern that it fits in. But I think maybe like NE, because it's more breadth oriented, is that how you say it? It looks for more variances. NE, TI kind of likes to maybe inspect variances in patterns more, whereas NI is kind of more about that investigating that common thread that lies beneath like multitudes of things. So it's looking for that. I don't even know how you put it. Michael?
No, I don't know either. It's the thread, the NI thread that's underneath under the underlying thread of NI, you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like, yeah, I mean, NI doesn't go outward, it comes inward, and that's sort of the connection points. It's just odd because it just feels like it's always shifting with every new experience. It's almost like your sense of reality is shifting all the time. It's very like metaphysical. I don't know. It's like it goes down to fundamental levels of like how you're perceiving reality. I think that's why a lot of like I think that's why we got the rap of just like questioning reality all the time, is because we always are just naturally. You know?
Yeah, and I wonder if it's because of the lack of SI, because the SI, if you had concrete experiences to go back to, you wouldn't be shifting in your sense of reality all the time. But because NI doesn't really anchor itself in any SI particular concrete things, it can feel like a shifty sense of nebulous sense of self and like the world, because it's not being grounded by any concrete crystallized thing, if that makes sense. So to be an NI user, it feels kind of like fluid to be a perceiver dom.
Yeah, fluid, but also you feel adrift too, because there isn't that anchor point with SI. I feel like I have no SI. I feel like I have no connection to my past. I look at photos of myself as like a kid and I have no nostalgic connection to it. I don't feel any physical connection to it. I don't feel like it's the same person. I mean, I'm very detached from SI. It's just memory of experience in general is extremely hazy at best.
Yeah, and I wonder why that's why like NI users say that they're viewing things from a bird's eye view. Because when you look at like a past photo of yourself, you don't actually really identify with it because you're looking at it from 10,000 feet above. And then you're like, because you're not SI like attaching or like fixating on any part of it, it feels like it's not a part of you almost. And it's something to meta-analyze almost. I don't even know how to explain that experience, but I'm trying.
It's really interesting. I'm listening to you guys talk, and I'm thinking about, if you had the choice between the two of the SI NE pair or the NI SE pair, like what the trade-offs are, right? And I think there's interesting trade-offs because I guess I hadn't thought about how valuable SI might, because there's a way that, like, I don't know, I feel like anyone who doesn't have NI is kind of a little bit jealous of NI just because it is the best at making connections. And like, it's funny, like how what you call, being adrift, like you call fluidity. And like, I see it as a tremendous advantage because, especially as an INTP, like what we're talking about before with like rightness and being fixated on things and how hard it is when something doesn't fit your model. Like NI has no problem when something doesn't fit the model. Like it can just deal with that. So I think there's tremendous advantage there. You have the best like pattern recognition and like the ability to take in any information and integrate it. Whereas I guess the advantage of SI seems like, well, maybe you can't do all that, but you know where you got your idea from.
Yes. That's a major advantage, by the way, Tim. It kind of feels like to NI, all the concrete data points are incomplete until they merge into an intuitive line of thought. And you're looking like, okay, so all of the perspectives are somewhat incomplete. Like Michael had the analogy of water and it has multiple states. So someone's presenting to you the perspective of gas and liquid and solid, and then you're seeing all of these concrete points as incomplete until you figure out that it's actually water. So it's almost like seeing everything with a grain of salt, and it's treating the sensory like that. It's a grain of salt until it adds to an understanding.
Yeah, I also think of it like a prism with NI, that it's very prismatic. It's almost like information that's coming in. It's like you turn a prism and you see how light is refracting through this idea at every angle. And if there's some angle that's missing, like there's just knowing to go out and pursue that perspective because you don't have a full understanding of what that thing is. But unless there's a final connection point, this is why I'm jealous of TI, and unless it does connect to something concrete in the end, like it's just information just isn't there until it's complete. It feels like, and it might be a TE thing too. There's also what I'll put in a word for NE too, because it's very likable. NE is very likable.
Yeah.
There's a childlike aspect to it as well. We get old soul a lot, I think, for INJs. We're like 75 years old, like 12, so I think, yeah. So there's a kindness about,
That's
INTP types.
That's funny. Well, there's a big disadvantage to NE, and that is like, if that's where you're good at generating patterns, you actually have to go out and do stuff to have any insights or patterns whatsoever. Like you can't, like, it's hard, like being an introvert and being SINE. It's like, if you don't get out of your comfort zone and go do things, like, you're not going to be that interesting of a person. You're not going to, like, you're never going to get a very good TI model either, because you're probably in a very narrow band of information that can come to you. And unless you purposefully go outside of that, you're going to have a lot of experiences where you have information that comes in and then you disregard it because you think it doesn't fit, when really it would have. You just needed to have a bigger TI model that would have only come from having SI experienced all of your NE extroversion going out. So yeah, I don't know.
That is so cool. Michael, I want to add a little to your prism example too. And it feels like, okay, whatever you see in the outer world is the output of the prism. So when you put light through a prism, it refracts into these other pieces. And what NI tries to do is it takes the output of the prism and it retraces it back to when it was in the prism and like in its beginning state, because it's like to figure out what exactly is it pointing to, because everything is like a refracted imperfect perspective. So if I retrace it back, then how can I understand this better? Or what is causing this to be a little bit refracted oddly? And if I retrace it back, how can, NI is known for seeing patterns within patterns, or like viewing a pattern without in your own mind and retracing a person's mental thought pattern back to its origin. So then you can place it into an understanding that makes sense. And you're like, okay, when I retrace this thought that this person has, I understand that it is actually this. So it's not taking it at surface value, but it's going like, if I retrace it back to its roots, what is this actually saying? And it feels like this, you're going reverse from the prism and you're just getting where it came from, if that makes sense. And approaching like everything that way. Or maybe
it makes sense to me. I'm wondering if that makes sense to Tim, because it does sound extremely abstract.
I kind like, it would be so awkward to live inside your headspace. I wouldn't know how to navigate that. Like,
take a nap. You take a nap. That's how you navigate it. Take a nap, solve a problem,
Yeah.
I guess what we could also address is FE and FI and how you guys experience it. So Tim, how is inferior FE for you?
How is it? I would say I like my FE. I like that I have it. I think that in a certain way, the point of TI is FE, because it's also like the motivation. Like, I think that like good TI should have like people and society as a thing that it focuses on building its model around, right? But it's also like kind of the point of building that whole TI model is so it can be expressed and conveyed to other people in the world, right? And FE, I see as the skill set that comes built into you to kind of understand other people and their social roles and the way they communicate and stuff like that. FI does that too, but differently. So having inferior FE though, and having it be the inferior, it can be a struggle at times. And I would say that a lot of the work that I've done and do on myself is around building the FE skill set, because I would say it comes naturally to me, but only to a certain point, at which point I am not so skilled. And also it's an area of vulnerability in that if I'm FE overwhelmed, I can kind of like lose myself and not make sense. And I turn into like a puddle of a person. Like I'm not like, I guess it's hard to be having feeling as your inferior, I suppose, because when you don't have a lot of skill around that, emotional situations can just be really difficult to navigate.
Michael, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's the other side of the coin of what Tim was describing. You said it's a bit of a curse to have NE because you have to leave the
house
as an introvert. Yeah, no, which I totally get. I think the thing is not having FE is, considering the fact that we're social beings, there's a kind of individualism that just doesn't map onto like what kind of species we actually are. I don't feel it always feels like a chore to connect, and it feels like it drains energy, but like you have a human need to do it. We're at the time that we're recording this, we're like a month into quarantine. I could do this for years. I have more energy now after a month of quarantine than I have in a while. Just general, like just lack of exhaustion. And I think without FE, and especially maybe with FI in the tertiary, where it's sort of it's a funny position, because like you could really fall back into that sense of like individualism, which has a good side and a very bad side to it, and not want to connect or even want to like flout convention and be destructive when it's in an unhealthy state. If you're not happy with the way a society in general or a specific social situation is, and you don't have FE and that sort of just natural sense of like at least striving for connection, it can be destructive. So it's something actually to consciously work on, I feel like, for a lot of INTJs, because like if it's in the end, like my natural state, my default state feels like a state of not connecting with people. I've lived in isolation, self-imposed isolation for long periods of time, at times when I was less a less well-balanced INTJ, I guess, and it took conscious work to get away from that. And to develop that function that's a total blind spot to me, at least.
This is really profound. Tim, it looked like you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been thinking about this. It's very kind of incomplete thinking, but FI is kind of like, if there's any function with a dark side, it's FI.
It is the dark side. Yeah.
It is the dark side. And like but the thing is it's like so necessary, because I've kind of had to try to align my TIFE polarity with a TEFI way of thinking of things sometimes, because it's like, okay, I'm a TI driver. I'm apt to get into these crazy vortexes where I want to learn everything about this, and I'm reading books and it blah, blah, blah. And I can spend months just learning about something that's really interesting to me, and it has no applicability anywhere ever. And it's a total waste of my time. Right? So like I've learned that I need to kind of like take that perspective at some point. It's like, okay, like is this thing I'm focusing on, is it TE useful? Like, am I going to need to know this to make a decision later? Is that decision going to affect other people or not? Like, is it worth anything? And then like, is it something that I really like? And knowing, do I really like it or not? Like the FI side of it. Because if something doesn't resonate with FI or with TE, then it needs to go. Then it's frivolous. Like I have to have some sort of focus, like in my life. I have to have a direction or something. And I think that can only come from FI. And I think that while having FI maybe somewhere in your stack, like your tertiary position, like has its difficulties, like having some connection with it, I think is really useful, because you're not spending your time wandering around, meandering, not knowing, where, I don't know. Does that make sense? Is that?
Yeah, I think it needs to be tamed. That tertiary function needs to be tamed, and I think I assume like the same would go for SI in the tertiary, right? Because it can fall back into that sort of SI fog, just like FI can fall back into just the darkness of the abyss, if you're not doing work. So I mean, I think it's important to work on that tertiary function. But yeah, working on those functions that are outside of your stack, like you need them. We have all 8 functions. It's just a way of interpreting how people work that seems to map onto people, right? So we do all of these things, but it's like it can be a lot of work, and especially when it comes to FE, if you have a certain way of like being in the world that doesn't register something like FE, or that doesn't register TE for that matter, right? Like it's a very FE-TE culture. So no matter what, you've got a blind spot between one of the two,
That's a good way of putting it.
So that is an amazing way of putting it. And I do agree that it is an FE-TE culture, because like the FE is like the social norms, the social contracts, the social agreements unspoken between groups to keep them functioning. And like the TE is like the getting stuff done. How would you explain TE culture, Michael?
TE culture, just I don't know, like I'm speaking as an American, just American, like, just pull yourself up by the bootstraps, go make it happen, get things done kind of culture, productivity culture, all of this.
Yeah. So it's kind of like, it's a culture that encourages either like social maintenance or your productivity maintenance, or like some area of that. So Tim, how do you feel like involved in these cultures?
Well, I think one thing about American culture that sort of fits in with that TE idea is that it does have this aspect of individualism, which is really more FI, but TE FI, that I think a lot of other cultures maybe don't have to the same extent. I know my experience. My brief experience, like in Asia, like it seemed very, very FE. The way that anything got done was FE. You knew somebody who did that, and that their cousin knows a guy that's got a thing to sell you. Like it's very, very human connection network. And there's, I think, a kind of homogeneity of a culture like that, where you're sort of pressured to fit in and be like part of that structure, whereas American culture does honor more like, okay, you have a vision, you want things to be this way, you're going to go found a company, you're going to make it this, like there's a much greater acceptance of that individualism. That's one of those differences that it's hard to put like a value on it. Is it good or bad? I would say that for me as an INTP, so it can be frustrating sometimes when you look out at the world and you see people doing things that don't make sense, and you meet people that really struggle to be able to discern truth from misinformation. So there is like a sense of like okay, I have this conception of the world where like I could see so much how easily it would be for it to be better, but then like there's not a mechanism to enact that or change that or do that. Whereas I don't know if FITE takes as big of a picture as FETI, because FETI is really trying to look at, I think, everybody and then like how to make sense of that. Whereas FITE is like, okay, this is what's inside. How do I bring that out? So maybe TEFI doesn't have as big of a picture, but it's so much better at actually getting stuff out and improving the world. I don't know. I totally went off on tangents there, but
no, I think this is a really good conversation. I mean, just to add to that, just in general, in terms of the culture, it's like if you take any ideology is an explanation of how history works, how nature functions. I mean, it's all encompassing. It's an all-encompassing logic of how things work, but it's impersonal. So if you follow the logic of any ideology, it leads toward a very inhuman place and a totalitarian place. Mm-hmm. So that includes something like Enlightenment ideology, which is what American culture is really grounded in. But what it leads to, if the culture isn't careful, and if you don't accept the outliers in the system into the system, then it can tend toward the worst kinds of TE and FE. And the worst kind of TE, I feel like, is, and it ties in with TI too, but I'd say TE because it's imposed on the world. What it is like just the quantification and abstraction of everything. And it's everything is tailored for the middle of the bell curve, and any outlier is cast out. And with FE, the dark side there, I would say, is a conformity that is, a kind of groupthink that excludes individuality. And it's something that I think we need to be conscious of, including doing this, because what are we doing when we talk about 16 types or however many types, is quantifying and abstracting. But then the interesting thing is not that system, and not the interesting thing is where like what are the outliers and how does the entire system form? Everything blend. Like at some point there's a spectrum where it turns into something else, and it's like we're always shifting, like how our understanding of the system and our observation of it. So that's why, and the last thing I'll say on this is that's why the subjective element and the non-scientific element of this system is important to preserve. Because I think it allows for strangeness, it allows for uniqueness, it allows the outliers in, and I could go on about that for a while. But I think overall, like it's ideology, like the culture needs to mind, like it needs to diversify ideologically, and that can lead to some irrational places in a good way, because you want a little dissonance, and you don't want to follow the logic of one idea to the end, because it's always going to lead to an inhuman place.
Yeah, I totally agree, Michael. And I feel like some of your FI showed through here, because you're like sharing a perspective that might not be that popular. And like the thing is, you're both thinkers, but INTJs have FI as the third slot, and what it causes is they can say an opinion that, well, all thinkers can, but like INTJs, because they have FI, like they can say an opinion that goes against the group, but because it is like there's some sort of, I don't know how to explain it, but FI users, they'll say their opinion even if it'll cause tension with how the group will see it, and they're more okay with it. And Michael just did that right now, so I thought it was a good example.
Yeah, bring it on, guys.
That's like fantastic. And thank you so much, guys, for coming on. I feel so energized talking to you both. I felt like my need to speak about concepts abstractly have been met, and I feel like full. Like I feel like my abstract cup has been filled through our good conversation together, and I just feel very energized and alert. It feels like when I talk about like abstract concepts, it makes me more alert, because then I feel like my brain's being used and I'm like, oh man, my brain feels like it's working. So thank you guys for meeting that that abstract need inside every intuitive or person. I bet every person has this too. But thank you so much for coming on. You guys are very like smart, brilliant, and I'm so lucky to be both of your friends. Like it just brings a smile on my face, and I'm glad we had a chance to talk. Yeah, I feel like exponentially happier having a conversation with you both. So thank you. And bye. I like and subscribe if you like this video, and I'll include any links Tim and Michael give me below if they do. And I hope you guys stay safe during the quarantine. And I hope the world treats you well. Bye, guys.
Thanks.